Russian position is that our demographic structure is in such diseased and aged and terminal decline that the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometimes between 2050 and 2070 anyway. Yeah. They've had a series of big melon scoops out of their birth rate throughout the history. World War I, World War II, the collectivizations under Stalin, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse. And a lot of these stack on top of each other. And the biggest one stacked on top of the post-Cold War collapse. So there are more Russians in their 50s than their 40s than their 30s than their 20s than teens. And then they lie about the data of the teenagers on down. Which means that there aren't enough Russians that have been born in the last 30 years to carry the ethnicity forward much farther. And so they're thinking if they can forward position their military and plug those gaps now with their last generation of young people, then they can kind of die on their own terms 50 years from now. One way or another, this is the end of Russia. The question is whether it dies in the long term on their terms or in the shorter term when they're completely unmoored. Because if they fail to secure those borders, then they've got a 2,000-mile open border with countries they consider to be hostile, and they have no way of moving troops around in a way that would allow them to defend it. They'd just be waiting for somebody to come over and knock them over. The Russian space is among the worst farmland in the world, and so they've never been able to generate enough income to have a road network. Everything has to be moved by rail. And their frontiers are just huge and they're open. And if you've got a force that can't maneuver itself, your only reasonable defense strategy is to be forward positioned and use geography to help you out. So you expand until you reach mountains or oceans or deserts, and then you anchor on either side of those and plug the access points. Unfortunately for Ukraine, there are two of those access points on the other side of Ukraine. So the Russians were always going to try to push through and retake that territory that they had controlled for most of the last 350 years. Unfortunately for them, in the 35 years since the Soviet system collapsed, the Ukrainians have developed an identity. And now they would like to be something other than a road bump. So the Russian point of view is for us to be secure, we need to expand until we reach a point where invaders cannot overwhelm us. We have to be able to plug those access points. But to give the Russians what they want, you have to sign over the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Belarus, Ukraine, let's go on, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all the stands. Basically, the Russians, in order to feel safe, they have to be able to occupy total populations that are twice of their own. And I'm sorry, but that's just not feasible. So, technically, the people who claim that NATO provoked this are correct. NATO can't have what it wants in Russia in order for Russia to feel safe. But for Russia to feel safe, they've got to occupy over 180 million people. And that was never part of the game. Ukraine, the last war in 2014, basically rolled over. They proved to be militarily incompetent, they were corrupt, they couldn't put up any sort of resistance. Crimea fell in just a matter of a couple of days. And I think a lot of us who are in the security side of things thought that this was going to be, to a degree, a bit of repeat. Now, excuse me, I was probably one of the more optimistic people for Ukraine because I had seen them develop a culture and seen them arm and train and had seen it be meaningful. But Ukraine's still a flat country and the Russians are still one of the largest militaries in the world. So even I was saying that within 6 months to a year, this was all going to be over. But the Ukrainians have surprised to the upside, and probably most importantly, the Europeans didn't just roll over and let this happen like they did the last 7 times that the Russians have gone on the warpath since 1999. And that's changed the game fundamentally. Well, the Ukrainians are the underdog, but they're in the process of rapidly arming with more and more sophisticated equipment. And by the time we get to May, they will have been able to do a lot of deferred maintenance on the equipment they captured from the Russians, which was more equipment than they started the war with. And there will be 60,000 Ukrainian troops that have trained in NATO countries with more advanced equipment back in the field. So, we get our Athens, if you will. On the other side, the Russians will have finished their second mobilization, and they will have at least another 500,000 men in the field. Now, they will be badly trained and badly equipped and badly led with low morale. But troops like that have a technical term attached to them. Russian. There's nothing about this war that is unique in Russian history. The first year is always an absolute shit show. And then the Russians throw bodies at the problem until it goes away. And in half of those wars, the Russians ultimately win. So by the time we get to May and the mud season is over, we'll have a more advanced Ukrainian force fighting a much larger Russian force, and we will get our first real glimpse at how this is going to go, and we should know which way it's going to break. Now, it'll still take time, because if the Russians are going to win, it's going to take them a year to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, and then they have to occupy the country, and that's going to kill a couple million people. Or the Russians are going to be able to completely break the logistical supply chains that allow the Russian troops to even exist, and we'll have 500,000 dead Russians, and the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of Crimea in the east. And then we get to talk about the next stage, because this is just the opening phase of what is going to be a multi-year and perhaps even multi-decade conflict. Right now, the balance of forces clearly are edging more and more towards the Ukrainians. They've proven to be more adaptable. When the Russians made it clear that they were going to do a second mobilization, that seemed to have broken the logjam in a lot of countries, most notably Germany. And we now have armored vehicles up to and including some light battle tanks, which I know all the tankies out there are going to hate that term. But anyway, armored vehicles that have some serious firepower are going to be coming now. The Bradleys from the United States specifically. And that is it's a tool that the Ukrainians have not had. So every time the Ukrainians have achieved a tactical breakthrough, they can only push as far as their infantry can run. Now their infantry is going to be mobile. And in a war of movement to this point, the Russians have proven that they're absolutely incompetent. The guy who is the defense minister, Shoigu, he's arguably one of the least competent people on the planet. But he's a friend of Putin, and so he's been able to milk the Defense Department for everything. Best guess is that he has taken a third of the budget himself for procurement, and his flunkies have taken another third, so very little gets to the military itself. I've not been as concerned about the nuclear question as some folks, because there's really only 4 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the Russians consider throwing one against the United States. But we've made it very clear from our intercepts and our sharing of information with the media that we know exactly where Putin is at any time. We're listening to his phone calls. We're reading his emails. And so he now knows very clearly that if he throws a nuke at the United States, we're going to throw one not at Russia, we're going to throw one at him. And there's no version of this where he survives. So he has tamped down the rhetoric quite a bit since last March. Option number 2, nuking Ukraine, that doesn't make sense. They want to occupy Ukraine. You don't want to have your troops in a place that's a radioactive wasteland. There may have been a case last year for nuking Poland and Berlin and Stockholm in order to disrupt the weapons flows into Ukraine. But after the battles of Izium and Kherson, the Ukrainians have more Russian gear now than they know what to do with. It's going to take them months to bring that all online. There's a lot of deferred maintenance that needs to be done. And so disrupting the weapons flows no longer is a critical issue because the weapons are already there. So the only scenario I can see where the Russians would seriously consider nukes is if Ukraine doesn't simply win, but decides to carry the fight across the border into Russia proper. In that scenario, where the very existence of the Russian government is threatened, that would probably change the math. But I don't find that likely without a significant shift in mindset in Washington, because we're not just providing the Ukrainians with the weaponry and the ammo, we're providing them with the intelligence and most of the steps of the kill chain. Without that, the weapons are of limited usefulness, especially at long range. And the Ukrainians have no desire to rupture that relationship. So we're talking about a theoretical that is at a minimum 7 months away, probably further. Number 1, the Russians are relatively casualty immune. They fight in an area where they fight with numbers. They've never been technologically advanced versus their peers. They've always just thrown bodies at it. So there has never been a conflict in Russian history where they have backed out without first losing 500,000 men. We're at about 100,000 now. We have a long way to go before the Russian military breaks.
So we're complete with low fly at this time, passing 070 for 140, looking to RTB, linking via SEPCO.